There are stories that are meant to be written, and stories that are meant to be spoken. And then there are stories that know when to change shape. In the old traditions, nothing sacred stayed in one vessel forever. Myths shifted from stone to page. Songs moved from mouth to firelight, from firelight to memory, from memory into hands, into breath, into the quiet spaces where listening becomes remembering. Wisdom traveled wherever breath could carry it. What endured was never the container, it was the devotion. Stories learned how to walk when the road shifted. They learned how to loosen their grip on stone and page, how to leave a hearth without extinguishing the fire. This is how they survived. There is a moment in every old story when the road forks, when a story no longer asks to be carried the same way, when it leans close and whispers, "Not here, not like this, not anymore." That moment is not failure, it is recognition. In the old world, this was understood. Nothing living was meant to remain static. Even magic moved on when its work was complete. But every familiar knows when it's time to leave the hearth and walk another road. What you are hearing now is not an ending. It is the sound of a familiar lifting its head from the hearth, of a story shaking loose the shape it once needed so it can take another form. This is the sound of a threshold being crossed, quietly and deliberately, with gratitude for the road already walked, and reverence for the one that waits beyond the firelight. The hero does not always choose the louder path. Sometimes the choice is quieter. Sometimes the choice is to stop walking forward and step sideways into another world entirely. This story has walked with you for a while now. It has lived in your ears, in your quiet moments, in the space between listening and remembering. What you are hearing now is not an ending. It is the sound of a story turning its face toward a new horizon. This is the Forgotten Familiar, where the old ways are remembered, the forgotten feminine is unearthed, and history's quiet rebellions are whispered back to life. I'm your host, Sarisa. Today's episode is a little different. This is not a deep dive into a single myth, goddess, or ritual. There is no single goddess waiting in the wings, no trial to unravel, no fragment of folklore pulled from the margins and set beneath a lens. This is a story about stories themselves, about how they travel, about when they stay, and about when they ask to be carried somewhere else. Every living tradition knows that what is meant to endure must also know when to change form. And in this episode, we stand at that turning. We know how all good stories begin. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, women carried stories the way they carried water. Carefully, purposefully, never wasting what could not be replenished. They told them while working, while cooking, while tending children and fires and fields. They told them in whispers when speaking aloud was dangerous. They braided truth into myth so it could pass unnoticed. They trusted what needed to endure would find its way. These women understood something we've largely forgotten. A story is not owed permanence. It is owed honor. And honor sometimes means letting go. Once upon a time, a familiar walked beside a storyteller. It sat at the edge of the circle while the words were spoken. It watched as listeners gathered, leaned in, remembered themselves. It did its work quietly, anchoring, guarding, lending shape to something unseen. But familiars were never meant to stay forever. They stayed as long as the work required that particular form. And when the work changed, they changed with it or they left. Not in anger or disappointment, but in completion. We tend to imagine them as creatures bound for life. The cat at the hearth, the crow on the shoulder, the spirit that never leaves its witch. But in older tellings, a familiar was not a possession. It was a companion for a season. When the work changed, the familiar changed. There are stories of familiars who walked away at dawn, vanishing into hedgerows or forests, their task finished, not abandoned, not lost, just fulfilled. The witch would mourn briefly, and then she would listen. A familiar that leaves is not a rejection, it is a message. The work has shifted and the magic wants a new form. History is full of these departures, though we rarely name them. The temple that closed so the teaching could move into homes. The oral tradition that faded so the written word could carry what remained. The song that stopped being sung publicly because it needed to be protected instead. Once upon a time, endings were not feared. They were understood as thresholds, guarded and guided by deities who witnessed the crossing. A story did not die when its form changed. It simply stepped sideways into another world. And the storyteller, if she was wise, did not cling. She watched. She listened. She followed the work where it wanted to live next. That is how stories survived centuries of erasure. That is how history's quiet rebellions were never fully silenced. That is how the old ways learned to hide in plain sight, waiting for a moment when they could breathe again. Once upon a time, stories were not content. They were not scheduled, optimized, or measured by reach. They were not packaged for strangers. They were not expected to survive without giving something back. Once upon a time, stories were living things. They were spoken when the room was ready. They were told when the fire was lit and the listeners had arrived with open hands. They moved through bodies, not platforms. They changed depending on who was present and what that moment required. A story told too early would fall flat. A story told too late would turn brittle. A story told in the wrong place might lose its power altogether. So the storytellers listened. They learned to feel when a tale was restless, when it began to tug at the edges of its own skin, when it wanted to stretch or wander or leave the path that once held it. History remembers the stories that survived. It forgets the countless others that were laid down intentionally, not because they failed, but because they had already done what they came to do. Once upon a time is not the beginning of a fairy tale. It's a reminder that everything living has seasons. A reminder that magic is not static. A reminder that what matters most is not how long something lasts, but whether it is allowed to change without being betrayed. This story, the one you are hearing right now, belongs to that lineage. It is not an ending. It is remembering how to move. There is a modern myth that says endurance is the same thing as success, that if something is meaningful, it must also be permanent, that stepping away is the same as failure. But that myth is young, and it has never served storytellers well. The older wisdom teaches us something else entirely. It teaches that devotion without reciprocity becomes sacrifice, that creation without nourishment turns hollow, that even sacred work can become unsustainable if it is asked to live in a vessel that no longer fits. When I began The Forgotten Familiar, I wanted to give voice to the women, the myths, the quiet rebellions that history tried to hush. I wanted to tell stories the way they were once told, with reverence, curiosity, and a little bit of fire. And it has been meaningful, deeply so. It has reached farther than I expected. It has found listeners who recognized something ancient stirring beneath the words. But meaning alone is not what sustains work. The old ways were never built on depletion. They were built on reciprocity. And I have come to see, clearly and without bitterness, that this container no longer serves the work as it wants to live now. The stories are not asking to be consumed quietly in isolation. They are asking to be witnessed, to be spoken into rooms where breath is shared, where questions can rise, where memory moves both directions. Telling stories is not just about what is spoken. It's also about where they are held. I've come to understand that these stories are asking for a different room now. A room with breath, with presence, with reciprocity. This podcast was never meant to be a monument. It was meant to be a bridge. And bridges are crossed, not camped upon. The truth is simple, even if it is not easy to say. This form has asked for more than it can give back. And listening to that truth is not a betrayal of the work. It is an act of care. The old ways were never about relentless output. They were about balance, about tending the fire without burning down the house. So this reflection is not an apology. It is an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the stories are still alive, that they are still needed, that they are simply asking to be told in a way that honors both the teller and the telling. To recognize that moment, to feel it and not look away, is part of the work too. And that perhaps is the quietest rebellion of all. So this is not an ending born of loss. It is a turning. The Forgotten Familiar as a podcast will rest here. The episodes that have been spoken will remain as echoes, artifacts of a chapter that served its purpose well. But the stories themselves are not finished. They will continue on Patreon, not as a broadcast, but as a gathering. Not just as a feed, but as a living exchange. In live spaces, in shared moments, in places where the work can breathe and answer back. If you have followed me here, know this. You are not being left behind. You are being invited forward. This is not a disappearance. It is a return to an older way of telling. In the old stories, when a fire was meant to rest, it was never drowned. It was covered gently, its embers guarded, its warmth trusted to return when called. That is what happens here. This chapter closes not because the work has failed, but because it has been faithful. Faithful enough to listen, faithful enough to change shape when the moment arrives. A hearth sealed with intention, a familiar released with gratitude, a story laid down so any other may rise. This familiar is not disappearing. It is simply changing form. This familiar does not vanish into the dark. It steps forward, unburdened, carrying the same fire into a different night. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for carrying these stories with care. Stories like these do not disappear. They travel. And wherever the stories are told next, the old ways will still be there, waiting. let the old ways rise.